You're done here, Ben. Chase Montgomery slid a manila envelope across the conference table like he was dealing cards in Vegas, effective immediately. I'm Ben Crawford, 52 years old, and I'd just been fired from the company I helped build from a two-room office above a pizza joint. The envelope hit the mahogany table with a soft thud that somehow managed to echo louder than Chase's smug announcement. I didn't touch the envelope, didn't even look at it. Just sat there while the Monday morning sunlight streamed through those floor-to-ceiling windows that cost more than most people's cars. The same windows I'd helped Howard Montgomery Sr. pick out when we moved into this building 8 years ago, back when he still asked my opinion on things that mattered. Generous severance package, Chase continued, straightening his $200 tie. Plus full benefits through the end of the year. Dad wanted to make sure you were taken care of. Dad. Not Howard, not Mr. Montgomery, not even the CEO. Just Dad, like this was a family business instead of a publicly traded company processing $2.3 billion in compliance data every quarter. Which, I suppose, it had become over the years. Taylor Montgomery, his sister, and our so-called VP of Innovation Strategy nodded along from her seat at the far end of the table. She was 29, fresh from some startup accelerator program, and had the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no by anyone who mattered. Her tablet was out, stylus ready, like she was taking notes for her LinkedIn post about streamlining operations. It's really about modernization, she chimed in, not looking up from her screen. We're pivoting toward agile methodologies and cloud-native architectures. Your legacy systems approach just doesn't align with our digital transformation roadmap anymore. Legacy systems. That's what they called the Crawford Integration Protocol. The same protocol that processed compliance data for 847 financial institutions across North America. The same system that had kept Meridian Systems from getting fined into bankruptcy by federal regulators for the past 9 years. The same architecture that took me 3 years to design and another 2 to perfect, working weekends and holidays while Chase was studying abroad and Taylor was getting her Instagram influencer certificate or whatever they called it. I picked up my coffee mug, the one with the old Meridian logo from back when we were Montgomery and Associates and actually cared about our clients more than our exit strategy. Took a sip of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago during the presentation about right-sizing our human capital allocation. That's corporate speak for firing people, in case you're wondering. When do you need me out? I asked. Chase blinked. I think he expected more of a fight. Maybe some pleading about my mortgage or my kids' college funds. Maybe some dramatic speech about loyalty and 24 years of dedicated service. But I'd been in corporate America since before these kids knew the difference between SQL and Excel. Once the decision's made, it's made. Fighting just makes you look desperate and gives them stories to tell at their rooftop cocktail parties. Today would be ideal, he said, trying to look sympathetic and failing completely. We've already transitioned your access credentials to the integration team. The integration team. 3 junior developers fresh out of coding boot camps who thought API stood for a pretty interface and whose combined experience wouldn't fill a summer internship. But they were young, cheap, and spoke the language of disruption that made investors feel like they were part of something revolutionary instead of just another compliance software company that happened to be profitable. I'd tried to train them over the past 6 months, ever since Howard Sr. started talking about succession planning and knowledge transfer protocols. But how do you explain 2 decades of regulatory changes, system failures, midnight crisis calls, and hard-won architectural decisions to kids who think debugging means Googling error messages? I stood up, pushed my chair back, and walked to the door. No handshakes, no final words of wisdom, no dramatic speeches about how they'd regret this decision. Just me, my dignity, and 24 years of institutional knowledge walking out of Meridian Systems for what they thought was the last time. The security guard, a guy named Eddie, who I'd shared countless late-night shifts with during system upgrades, couldn't make eye contact when he walked me to my car. Eddie had been here almost as long as I had, back when Montgomery and Associates had 12 employees and everyone knew everyone's birthday. Now we were Meridian Systems with 340 employees across 4 offices, and Eddie was just another face in a uniform following protocols written by someone in HR who'd never worked a weekend in their life. HR had already boxed up my desk. Personal items only, they said. They kept the technical manuals, the system documentation I'd written, The network diagrams I'd drawn by hand during the first major architecture overhaul in 2018, and the 3 monitors I'd bought with my own money because the company-issued ones gave me headaches during long debugging sessions. 24 years of my professional life reduced to a cardboard box containing a coffee mug, a desk plant, and a photo of my kids from their high school graduation. I drove home to my empty house, the one I'd bought 5 years ago during the divorce when splitting assets meant starting over at 47. The house that still echoed a little too much and had a back deck I kept meaning to fix, but never found the time for because I was always at the office, solving problems that apparently didn't matter anymore. Poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon, opened my laptop, and did what any rational person would do after getting fired. I started looking through old contracts. Not for a wrongful termination lawsuit. I was an at-will employee in a right-to-work state, which meant they could fire me for wearing the wrong color socks if they wanted to. Not for ammunition to badmouth them on LinkedIn. That's what bitter people do, and I wasn't bitter yet. I was looking for something specific, something I remembered signing back in March 2015 when we were splitting IP rights for tax optimization purposes. Howard Sr. had been worried about liability exposure after a compliance software company in California got sued for $50 million when their system missed a regulatory filing deadline. Smart move, splitting the technical assets into separate legal entities. Standard practice for companies our size. Found it at 11:47 p.m. in a folder labeled Tax Shield, March 2015, buried in my personal archive drive between expense reports and performance reviews I'd kept out of habit. The document was titled Intellectual Property Transfer and Licensing Agreement, Crawford Integration Protocol, dated March 15, 2015. 23 pages of legal language that I'd signed without reading too carefully because I trusted Howard Sr. back then, and because my divorce lawyer was charging me $400 an hour to review everything else in my life. I scrolled through the standard boilerplate about indemnification and liability limits, past the technical specifications that defined exactly what the Crawford Protocol did and didn't include. Page 9 had the meat of it. Section 12.7a, buried between clauses about maintenance responsibilities and update procedures. In the event that the primary architect and license originator is terminated from Meridian Systems, Inc. without documented cause prior to the full reversion date of March 15, 2025, all intellectual property rights, licensing agreements, and derivative work permissions shall immediately revert to Crawford Technical Holdings, LLC, effective upon termination date. I read it 3 times. Then I opened a new browser tab and checked the Delaware Secretary of State website. Crawford Technical Holdings, LLC, established March 12, 2015, sole member Benjamin Crawford, status, active and in good standing. Annual filing fee paid through 2024. My bourbon glass was empty. I poured another 2 fingers and called my attorney. Ben? Mike Hartley's voice was thick with sleep. It's almost midnight. Everything okay? Mike had handled my divorce and helped set up the LLC back in 2015. He was one of those lawyers who actually explained things in plain English instead of just billing you for reading incomprehensible documents aloud. Mike, I need you to look at something. The IP transfer agreement we did with Meridian in 2015, Section 12.7a specifically. I heard papers rustling. Mike kept physical files for everything, old school. Okay, I've got it. The reversion clause. What about it? They fired me today. No cause, just corporate restructuring. Long pause. Ben, do you understand what this means? I think I do. But I need you to tell me if I'm reading it right. You own the Crawford Protocol. As of today, Meridian has no legal right to license, sell, or even use the integration system without your permission. Every contract they've signed, every client they're servicing, every piece of revenue they're generating from that system, it all runs through intellectual property that belongs to you now. I stared out my kitchen window at the neighbor's house, where a blue glow from their TV flickered against the curtains. Normal people, living normal lives, probably watching late-night talk shows instead of discovering they accidentally owned the crown jewels of a $400 million acquisition deal. Mike, there's something else. Meridian is in the middle of selling to Atlantic Tech Solutions. The deal's supposed to close next week. Holy shit, Ben. Do they know about the reversion clause? I don't think anybody knows about it. I forgot about it myself until tonight. Mike was quiet for a minute, probably calculating billable hours in his head. Okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to draft a formal notice of license reversion. Nothing aggressive, just a professional notification that as of today, Crawford Technical Holdings LLC is the sole owner and licensor of the integration protocol. We'll send it to their legal department and copy Atlantic Tech's counsel. What happens then? Then we find out how badly they want to close this deal. I slept better that night than I had in months, not because I was happy about getting fired, but because I finally had some control over what came next. For the first time in years, I wasn't just reacting to other people's decisions. The next morning, I made coffee, read the Wall Street Journal, and waited for my phone to ring. It took until 10:15 a.m. Ben, it's Nathan Pierce. Nathan had been one of my junior developers at Meridian before jumping to Atlantic Tech 3 years ago. Smart kid, good instincts, one of the few people who actually understood why I'd built certain redundancies into the protocol instead of just accepting that it worked. Now he was their director of technical integration, which meant he was the guy tasked with making sure the $400 million they were about to spend actually did what the sales brochures promised. Nathan, been a while. Yeah, well, I heard about yesterday. That's rough, man. You doing okay? I'm fine. What can I do for you? There was a pause, the kind that happens when someone's trying to figure out how to ask a question they're not supposed to be asking. Look, I probably shouldn't be calling, but we're doing technical due diligence on the Crawford protocol, and some things aren't adding up. The documentation references implementation decisions that don't match what their current team is telling us. I wasn't surprised. The 3 kids on the integration team probably couldn't explain why I'd chosen PostgreSQL over MySQL for the primary data store, much less walk someone through the compliance algorithms that took me 2 years to perfect. They were good at following procedures and fixing obvious bugs, but they had no idea why the system was designed the way it was. What kind of things? I asked. Well, for starters, their lead developer thinks the transaction validation engine runs on machine learning. It doesn't, right? It's rule-based expert systems with decision trees. I almost laughed. Tommy Davis, their lead developer, was 24 years old and thought artificial intelligence was the solution to every problem that couldn't be solved with more RAM. Nathan, machine learning couldn't handle real-time compliance validation if you gave it a quantum computer and a team of Nobel Prize winners. The regulatory requirements change too fast, and the penalty for false positives is too high. You need deterministic logic, not probabilistic models. That's what I thought. But he showed us this presentation about upgrading to TensorFlow and implementing neural networks for pattern recognition. Pattern recognition for what? Compliance rules aren't patterns, they're legal requirements. Either a transaction meets the regulatory criteria or it doesn't. There's no gray area for machine learning to optimize. I could hear Nathan typing in the background. Ben, can I ask you something off the record? Shoot. Who actually owns the Crawford protocol? I took a sip of coffee and watched a cardinal land on my back porch, same spot where one had been sitting yesterday morning. That's an interesting question, Nathan. Why don't you have your legal team check the licensing documentation? Specifically, any agreement signed in March 2015. The line went quiet for about 10 seconds. Are you telling me what I think you're telling me? I'm not telling you anything. I'm suggesting your lawyers do their jobs. Ben, if what I think you're suggesting is true, this deal is in serious trouble. The deal doesn't have to be in trouble, but it might need some adjustments. After I hung up, I made another pot of coffee and went out to look at my deck. The boards were starting to warp in places, and the railing needed sanding and staining. Physical problems with physical solutions. I'd been putting off this kind of work for years, always too busy with emergencies at the office, fires that needed putting out, systems that needed babysitting. Maybe it was time to start fixing things I could actually control. By 2 p.m., Atlantic Tech's legal team had found Section 12.7a. By 3 p.m., they'd confirmed with the Delaware Secretary of State that Crawford Technical Holdings was still active and in good standing. By 4 p.m., their lead counsel was on a conference call with Meridian's legal department, asking some very pointed questions about intellectual property ownership and due diligence procedures. I wasn't on that call, but I heard about it from Nathan, who heard about it from his boss, who was apparently sitting in the room watching Howard Montgomery Sr. turn 3 different shades of red while his son Chase tried to explain how firing the system architect 5 days before closing might have been a strategic oversight. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. the next morning. I got the call at 6:30 a.m. from Patricia Wells, Atlantic Tech's lead counsel. Her voice had the crisp efficiency of someone who'd spent her career cleaning up other people's mistakes and wasn't particularly surprised to be doing it again. "Mr. Crawford, I think we need to talk. I figured you might. Would you be available to join a conference call at 10 a.m.? There seem to be some questions about the technical architecture that only you can answer." "I'm available, but I should mention that I'm no longer employed by Meridian Systems." "Yes, we're aware of that. In fact, that's exactly why we need to talk to you." At 9:55 a.m., I dialed into the conference bridge and found myself in a virtual room with 12 people from Atlantic Tech and Meridian. Howard Sr. was there, looking like a man who'd just discovered his house was built on quicksand. His voice was tight when he introduced the participants, carefully not mentioning that his son and daughter were nowhere to be found. Patricia Wells ran the meeting with the efficiency of someone who'd negotiated $100 million deals before most people had their first cup of coffee. "Mr. Crawford, can you confirm that you are the sole owner of Crawford Technical Holdings, LLC? "I can. "And can you confirm that this entity holds the licensing rights to the integration protocol that is the primary asset in our proposed acquisition?" According to Section 12.7a of the March 2015 IP Transfer Agreement, yes. The termination of my employment without documented cause triggered the reversion clause. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when 8-figure deals suddenly become complicated. I could hear someone typing furiously in the background, probably taking notes for the inevitable lawsuit that would follow if this couldn't be resolved professionally. Howard Sr. cleared his throat. "Ben, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The IP assignment was always intended to be temporary, for tax purposes only. You know that. I understand that, Howard. But the assignment included specific reversion clauses. One of those clauses was triggered on Monday when your son terminated my employment without cause." "This is ridiculous," came a voice I didn't recognize, probably one of Meridian's lawyers, the kind who bill $800 an hour to sound outraged on behalf of clients who should have read their contracts more carefully. "The system was developed using company resources during company time, with company equipment." "Actually," I said, opening my laptop to the folder I'd prepared for exactly this conversation, "I have documentation showing that 73% of the core development was done on my personal equipment during weekends and evenings, using methodologies I developed independently before joining Montgomery & Associates. I also have email confirmations from Howard Sr. himself acknowledging that the tax optimization strategy required legitimate separation of the IP to be legally defensible. I'd spent yesterday morning going through old email archives, expense reports, and development logs. Amazing what you keep when you're naturally organized and slightly paranoid about corporate politics. Timestamps, equipment purchase receipts, version control logs showing commits from my home IP address on Saturday mornings and Sunday evenings." Patricia Wells spoke up. "Mr. Crawford, what would it take to resolve this situation?" I'd been thinking about that question for 36 hours, not in terms of revenge or payback, but in terms of what was fair, what was professional, what would let everyone move forward without destroying relationships or businesses that employed hundreds of people who had nothing to do with this mess. Atlantic Tech can license the protocol directly from Crawford Technical Holdings. Standard licensing terms, with me as the technical consultant overseeing implementation and maintenance. Meridian keeps their consulting contract for non-technical services and client relationships. "And the licensing fee?" she asked. "Same rate structure you were paying Meridian, but the contract goes directly to my company." Howard Sr. spoke up, his voice carrying 24 years of shared history and what sounded like genuine disappointment. "Ben, this isn't how we do business. We've been partners for 24 years. "You're right, Howard. Partners don't fire each other 5 days before closing a $400 million deal. Partners don't dismiss institutional knowledge as legacy thinking. Partners don't replace senior architects with junior developers who think machine learning is the answer to regulatory compliance." I heard someone suck in their breath sharply. Probably one of the Meridian lawyers realizing their clients had just admitted to the technical incompetence of their current development team on a recorded call with the acquiring company. Patricia Wells jumped back in before anyone could say something that would make the situation worse. Mr. Crawford, would you be willing to discuss specific terms with our team, separately from this call? I would. Excellent. Howard, I think Meridian needs to have some internal discussions about how to proceed. We'll reconvene once everyone has had a chance to review their options. The call ended with a series of polite goodbyes that fooled nobody. I hung up, made a sandwich, and went out to work on my deck. Physical work helps clear your head after dealing with corporate politics, and I had a feeling this was just the beginning of a very long negotiation process. At 4:30 p.m., Nathan called back. You know Chase and Taylor are both gone, right? Gone how? Howard Sr. called an all-hands meeting at 3 p.m., said they were taking extended leave to pursue other opportunities and focus on personal development. Translation, they're fired. I didn't feel vindicated or satisfied, just tired. When you've been in business long enough, you learn that sometimes the best revenge is just doing your job better than the people who tried to replace you. Sometimes, karma is just natural consequences catching up with bad decisions. What's the mood over there, I asked. Confused, mostly. Half the development team is asking if their jobs are safe. The other half is asking who's going to handle the Atlantic Tech integration if it goes through. Turns out nobody actually knows how the Crawford Protocol works except you. What about Tommy Davis? Wasn't he supposed to be the lead architect now? Nathan laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Tommy spent yesterday trying to explain to Atlantic Tech's technical team how our machine learning algorithms handle regulatory compliance. Patricia Wells had their compliance officer on the call. Guy's been working financial regulations for 20 years. Tommy might as well have been explaining how unicorns handle tax law. That night, I grilled a steak on my back deck and called my ex-wife Janet. We'd maintained a civil relationship after the divorce, mostly for the kids, but also because she was one of the few people who understood the technical side of what I did for a living. She'd been a project manager at a software company before going back to school for her MBA. So let me get this straight, she said after I explained the situation. They fired you, which automatically gave you ownership of the thing they're trying to sell? That's the simplified version, yes. Ben, that's either brilliant planning or the most expensive mistake in corporate history. I'm going with expensive mistake. I never intended for this to happen. But you're not complaining about it happening. Would you? She laughed. Hell no. Those kids needed to learn that experience matters. You should charge them double. The papers arrived the next morning via courier, hand-delivered to my front door by a guy in a suit who asked for 2 forms of ID before handing over the envelope. Inside was a licensing agreement between Crawford Technical Holdings LLC and Atlantic Tech Solutions, along with a consulting contract that made my old salary look like pizza money. The terms were straightforward. Atlantic Tech would license the Crawford Protocol directly from my company for the same $400 million they'd planned to pay Meridian, minus Meridian's cut for ongoing client services and integration support. My company would receive 60% of the licensing revenue, with Meridian keeping 40% for their existing client relationships and sales infrastructure. More importantly, I would serve as senior technical advisor for the integration, with final approval authority on any modifications to the core system. I read through the contract twice, called Mike Hartley to review the legal language, and signed it at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the morning news playing in the background. No boardroom ceremony, no champagne, no speeches about synergy and paradigm shifts, just me, a pen, and 24 years of experience finally being valued at market rates. Howard Sr. called that afternoon. His voice carried a weight I'd never heard before, the sound of a man who'd just watched his children torpedo the family business through sheer incompetence. Ben, I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything, Howard. You made a business decision. I made a business decision. That's how it works. My kids thought they could run this company better than the people who built it. They thought your experience was a liability instead of an asset. I could hear the frustration in his voice, the disappointment of a father who'd tried to hand over a successful business only to watch it nearly collapse in his children's hands. Your kids are smart, Howard. They just need to learn that smart isn't the same as experienced, and that disruption for its own sake isn't innovation. Will you consider coming back? Not to your old job, but as a senior advisor. Help us rebuild the technical team the right way this time. I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. The idea of sitting in meetings about agile transformation and digital disruption made my teeth hurt. I'll consult on specific projects through my company. But I'm done with office politics and daily meetings about meetings. I've got my own business to run now. Fair enough. What about the integration team? Tommy Davis is asking if he should start looking for another job. Tommy's a good kid. He just needs to understand that machine learning isn't the answer to every problem. Have him call me. I'll walk him through the compliance architecture so he can actually answer questions when Atlantic Tech's auditors come calling. 3 weeks later, the integration went live without a single compliance violation or system failure. Tommy Davis, properly mentored and armed with actual documentation, handled the technical deployment while I provided remote oversight from my home office. The Atlantic Tech team was impressed. Their compliance officer sent a bottle of bourbon and a note saying it was the smoothest regulatory system transition he'd ever supervised. 6 months later, Crawford Technical Holdings has 4 employees and contracts with 6 different companies to design and implement compliance systems. Atlantic Tech's integration was so successful they recommended us to 2 of their partners. Word spreads fast in the compliance software world when you actually deliver what you promise. Chase Montgomery is apparently working for a blockchain startup in Austin, where his MBA and enthusiasm for disruption are probably better suited to whatever it is blockchain startups do when they're not raising venture capital. Taylor launched something called a digital wellness consultancy that helps companies optimize their social media engagement strategies for maximum synergy. Her LinkedIn profile is full of inspirational quotes about authentic leadership and pivoting toward purpose-driven solutions. And me? I'm sitting in my home office at 7 a.m. working on problems that actually matter for clients who understand that good systems take time to build and experienced people to maintain. No more meetings about right-sizing human capital or leveraging core competencies for sustainable growth vectors. No more presentations about disrupting ourselves before someone else disrupts us. Just good, solid engineering work that keeps businesses running and regulators happy. Design systems that work, document them properly, train people to maintain them, and charge what the work is actually worth. It's exactly what I wanted to be doing at 52, but couldn't have imagined how to get here without getting fired first. The Cardinal is back on my porch this morning, sitting in the same spot it's claimed for the past 6 months. Still red, still territorial, still completely unconcerned with digital transformation initiatives or paradigm shifts. Some things don't need to change, and some things change whether you want them to or not. I've learned the difference, finally. After 24 years in corporate America, getting fired was the best thing that could have happened to my career. Not because I hated my job or resented Howard Sr., but because I'd forgotten that experience has value beyond just showing up and solving problems. I'd forgotten that institutional knowledge isn't the same thing as legacy thinking. I'd forgotten that being good at what you do should be worth something more than a cost center budget line and a performance review that rates you as meets expectations. Now I remember. And my clients remember too, every time their systems pass regulatory audits and process transactions without failing. Every time they need someone who understands that compliance isn't just about following rules, but about understanding why the rules exist and how they've evolved over decades of regulatory changes. Tommy Davis called yesterday to thank me for the mentoring. He's been promoted to senior developer and is working on a new project that actually uses his skills properly instead of asking him to reinvent systems that already work. The integration team has grown from 3 people to 7, and they're hiring experienced developers instead of just coding bootcamp graduates. Meridian is doing fine. Their stock price recovered after the Atlantic Tech deal closed, and they're focusing on what they do best, client relationships and business development. Howard Sr. is talking about retirement, real retirement this time, with succession planning that involves promoting people based on competence instead of genetics. The house is quieter now, but it's a good quiet. Productive quiet. The kind of quiet you get when you're not constantly stressed about office politics or worried about whether your job will exist next quarter. I fixed the deck, finally. Sanded and stained the whole thing over a weekend, working with my hands instead of my brain for a change. Sometimes you have to lose the game to realize you were playing by the wrong rules. Sometimes getting fired is the best career move you never planned to make. Sometimes the thing you think is the end is actually just the beginning of something better. The Cardinal chirped once and flew away. I poured another cup of coffee, opened my laptop, and got back to work. Real work, the kind that matters for people who understand what they're paying for. It's a good way to spend a Tuesday morning when you're 52 and finally understand the difference between having a job and having a career.